In a small Prussian city in the spring of 1762, the most punctual man in the Western philosophical tradition did not go for his walk, and it changed everything he thought he knew about you. You need to understand what that means. This wasn't a man who occasionally ran late. Immanuel Kant was so disciplined, so utterly clockwork in his habits, that the people of Königsberg, a city of merchants and sailors and tradesmen who had no reason to care about philosophy, reportedly set their watches by him. Every afternoon, at the same hour, Kant walked the same route, the same path, the same pace. For decades, he didn't skip it for illness, he didn't skip it for funerals, he didn't skip it for war, and war came close enough to matter. He skipped it for a book, and not just once. According to his biographers, he was so absorbed that he missed that walk for several days running. The neighbors noticed. They had to. Now, if you know anything about Kant, you probably know him as the philosopher of cold reason, the German professor who turned ethics into a logical machine, who spent 800 pages of the critique of pure reason dismantling what we can and can't know, and who, you may have heard, effectively made God unprovable to the modern mind. That version of Kant is not entirely wrong, but it is radically incomplete, and what it leaves out is the very thing that made him who he was. The book that stopped him was called Emile. The man who wrote it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a Frenchman, a romanticist, a man who didn't share Kant's faith in reason and didn't pretend to. And the idea at the center of that book was this: the ordinary person, the farmer, the craftsman, the mother who never read a philosophy text in her life, may be morally superior to the educated man who spends his days thinking about virtue without ever practicing it. That idea didn't just interest Kant, it arrested him. We know this because of what he wrote afterward. In private notes, not meant for publication, where the careful professor allowed himself a rare honesty. He confessed something that almost never appears in the introductory lectures or the popular accounts of his philosophy. Before reading Rousseau, Kant wrote, he had felt something very close to contempt for common, uneducated people. Not cruelty, not malice, something quieter, and in some ways more dangerous. The educated man's assumption that learning confers moral standing, that the person who can articulate a principle is closer to righteousness than the person who simply lives it. He wrote, Rousseau set me right. This blinding privilege disappears. I learned to honor man. Read that again slowly. I learned to honor man. Not, I refine my theory of man. Not, I revise my epistemological framework. The word he used was honor. That's a moral word, a relational word. The word you use when you recognize that something deserves more from you than you've been giving it. Kant, at roughly 40 years old, already a published thinker, already respected in European philosophical circles, sat down with a French book and came out the other side, having to admit that he had been wrong about something fundamental. The people he had looked past were not below the argument, they were the argument. Now here is what I want you to sit with before we go further. That assumption Kant had, the one Rousseau broke open, is not dead. It didn't die with the 18th century. It's alive in every conversation where someone waves away a moral conviction with, that's just your faith, or you wouldn't understand, it's complicated. It's alive whenever a person with decades of lived wisdom sits at a table and feels, quietly, that their convictions don't count the same as someone else's credentials. It's alive in the church that talks at its congregation instead of with them, and in the culture that treats experience as a lesser form of knowledge. Kant felt that assumption from the inside, recognized it as a corruption, and spent the next 2 decades of his career building a philosophy to dismantle it. If you've ever sat at a table, a holiday table, a dinner with adult children, a Sunday lunch, and felt that the things you believe most deeply are somehow not as legitimate as an argument someone pulled from a podcast or a sociology class, then you are living inside the exact problem Kant turned his life's work against. Stay with me, because where this goes is not where you expect. There is a detail about Kant's early life that almost never appears in the philosophy textbooks, and it belongs here. Kant's mother, Anna Regina, died when he was 13. She was a devout pietist, a tradition within German Christianity that emphasized personal faith, moral seriousness, and the interior life over ritual and church performance. She was not educated in the formal sense. She had not read Plato or Cicero or Leibniz. What she had was a moral presence that her son described, decades later, with unmistakable reverence. Kant credited her, specifically, with having shaped his moral character more than any teacher he later encountered at the university. The woman who died before he turned 14, who left behind no philosophical texts, who held no academic position, left a mark on the man who would write the most rigorous secular defense of moral duty in Western history. He knew at some level, before Rousseau made it explicit, the unlettered person who simply lives rightly is not below the philosophical argument. In Kant's case, she may have been its origin. When Rousseau's book arrived in 1762, it didn't introduce a foreign idea to Kant. It named something he had always half known and shamed him into admitting he hadn't honored it. That is the shape of a real moral correction. Not information received, recognition forced. Out of that correction, over the next 20+ years, Kant built what became the foundation of his ethics. And the center of it is a concept so simple that it sounds almost obvious once you hear it, and so radical that Western culture is still arguing about it. Every human being, he argued, possesses unconditional worth, not worth contingent on what they've accomplished, not worth earned by education, rank, status, or religious performance, not worth that can be taken away by failure, age, or cultural irrelevance. Unconditional worth, what he called word, dignity, belonging to every person simply because they are capable of making moral choices. In the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, published in 1785, he put it this way: act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. Always as an end, never merely as a means. What that means, in plain language, is this: no human being exists to be used. Not as a tool for your comfort or your agenda or your convenience, not even with their consent if the using degrades what they fundamentally are. Every person you encounter, the one who challenges your politics, the grandchild who walked away from the church, the neighbor you disagree with about almost everything, carries something that places them beyond being merely instrumental to your purposes. That is not a soft idea. It is one of the hardest ideas in moral philosophy, because it doesn't make exceptions for people who make it difficult. And notice where Kant arrived, coming from reason rather than revelation. He didn't quote Genesis, he didn't appeal to the authority of Scripture. He followed the argument wherever it led, and it led him here. Every human person possesses worth that is not contingent, not earned, not revocable. Now, Kant didn't frame it this way, and I want to be clear that this is the narrator's reading, not Kant's claim. But follow that principle and it lands exactly where an ancient text does. So God created mankind in his own image. Genesis chapter 1:27. The theological term for it is imago Dei. Every person bears the image of God and therefore possesses inherent dignity that no authority can grant and no failure can remove. Kant arrived there through reason. The scriptures arrived there through revelation. The destination is the same. A human being is not a tool, not a problem, not a lesser version of someone else. The person without the credentials, without the platform, without the theological vocabulary, that person carries full moral weight, which means the quiet, faithful life, the one that didn't make headlines, didn't accumulate accolades, didn't produce a philosophy book, was never beneath Kant's argument. His argument was always about that life. If you want to take what this video is building and actually put it to work, not just as a concept you understand, but as something you can use when the dinner table turns into a courtroom, there's something waiting for you in the description below. It's called the Argument Toolkit, 12 Kant-based responses to the challenges your family will throw at your values. 12 specific lines of reasoning, not debate tricks, not ways to win an argument, but honest, clear, philosophically grounded responses to the most common challenges to the convictions you've spent a lifetime building. The kind of response that doesn't require someone to accept Scripture as authority, because it doesn't start there. It starts exactly where Kant started, with what reason itself can show about dignity, duty, and the moral weight of an ordinary life. The link is in the description. Now back to Kant, because there's something about him that almost no one who dismisses him has ever heard. By the 1790s, Kant was the most famous philosopher in Europe. He was also, for a period, in genuine trouble with the Prussian government. Friedrich Wilhelm II, the king who succeeded Frederick the Great, was not interested in the Enlightenment's experiments with free thought. He wanted philosophers to support the church, defend the faith, and stop complicating things for ordinary believers. He issued a royal reprimand to Kant for his writings on religion, and Kant, then, in his 70s, agreed, under pressure, to write nothing further on the subject. He honored that agreement until the king died. The moment Friedrich Wilhelm II was dead, Kant published again. The man who had been called the destroyer of faith had spent his career trying to protect it from a threat that most of his critics never understood. The threat wasn't him. The threat was a certain kind of overconfident rationalism that claimed to prove, with scientific certainty, things that reason has no business proving, including whether God exists, whether the soul is immortal, whether human freedom is real. Kant's response was not to abandon those beliefs. His response was to put them where science cannot reach them. In the preface to the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, in a line that has been called one of the most important sentences in modern philosophy, he wrote, "I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith." Read that for what it actually says. He did not say faith is irrational. He did not say God is a fiction. He said, I had to draw a line around what reason can prove, not to shrink the world, but to protect the things that matter most from being destroyed by a form of certainty they were never meant to survive. Science can tell you how the universe operates. It cannot tell you what it's for. Reason can map the mechanics of moral behavior. It cannot, on its own, reach the question of why any of it finally matters. Kant didn't leave those questions unanswered. He relocated them to a place where they are safe. That is not the move of a man who wanted to destroy your faith. That is the move of a man who understood that your faith deserves better protection than the ones who were offering to defend it were actually giving it. Here is what the story of the interrupted walk actually means. The man who gave the Western world its clearest argument for human dignity, the dignity that belongs to you, to your children, to the grandchild who walked away, to the neighbor you've never agreed with about anything, that man had to be corrected first. He had to sit with a book and admit that he had been contemptuous of ordinary people. He had to recognize that the laborer who simply does right may carry more moral weight than the philosopher who reasons about righteousness without practicing it. He had to learn to honor man, and then he spent 20 years building the philosophy that honors you. The life you've lived, quietly, without credentials, without a platform, without anyone handing you a philosophical vocabulary to defend what you've always known, that life was never beneath this argument. Kant's argument was never for the credentialed. It was against the assumption that credentials are what moral worth requires. The walk he skipped was the beginning of that correction. The philosophy he built in its wake is the sturdiest intellectual defense your convictions have in the modern world. And it was built by a man who had to be broken open before he could build it. Rousseau broke him open. His mother had already planted the seed. And the concept of dignity that grew from that rupture has been quietly defending the worth of ordinary faithful lives for 240 years. You just didn't know it had your name on it. There's a question I want to leave you with. Not a rhetorical one. A real one. Not what do you believe? You've known that for decades. The question is, what is it worth? Not to you. You've settled that. But in the language the world actually uses now, and the arguments that get made at tables where scripture isn't accepted as final authority. What is it worth, and how do you know? Kant spent his life building the answer to that question. It took him a French book, a missed walk, and an honest admission about his own blind spot to get there. You've already lived the answer. You may just need the words. If there's one belief you've held for decades and never once been able to explain why, tell me what it is.